hope that you can see me well. Welcome. Hey, everyone. So before I share this vlog that I'm about to share with you, I just wanted to kind of talk about it because this is a vlog that I filmed last year, I think actually in June, pretty much. And I haven't shared it until today because I was talking about some really personal, vulnerable things. And I guess I just wasn't ready to share it until today. I'm ready to share it. And I think also, like, I needed a little bit of distance because at the time when I filmed this, I was really not doing very well. And that's also one of the reasons why I decided to share the vlog, or why I decided, like, one of the things that I wanted to talk about was some of the stuff that I was working on and working through. So I guess this is also like a trigger warning because I talk about mental health, I talk about abuse, I talk about complex PTSD, I talk about suicidal thoughts, which is one of the symptoms of complex PTSD. And I talk about the tools specifically that were helping me at the time. And that have helped me, I guess, up until now. Anyway, so this is a trigger warning for those of you who think that, you know, for whom it might be distressing to hear about this stuff. But I did want to share it because I wanted to share it. That's it. For me, sometimes I've found these vlogs really useful, even just for myself, to look back on. And I talk about that a little bit in the beginning of the vlog. But I think it's important to do it with a very kind of clear notion of why you're doing it and if you're okay with it really, like what your goal is. My goal is never to, I don't need support from you all, even though, you know, you guys are all sweethearts. And I wouldn't be sharing it if I didn't know that you guys are all sweethearts. But I'm wary of, I just want it to be clear that when I share these things, I am never asking you to do anything. The reason that I share is because it's helped me in my journey to see other people's journeys. And I do feel like there's kind of a lack of people talking about very serious mental health issues like PTSD, like complex PTSD. And like, I found it difficult, honestly, when I was in the worst of it, to not have anyone that I could look at who would show me like where I could see, oh, this is somebody who's actively recovering, actively healing from this. Not to say that I'm like healed. I still have, you know, some symptoms. Luckily, they're getting much better. For example, even in terms of like suicidal thoughts that I talk about in the rest of the vlog, I haven't had those in a long time, and that's amazing. I'm very, very grateful to be where I'm at today. But of course, the healing's never done. It's, you know, an ongoing journey, and I just wanted to share some of that journey with you. It's kind of a longish vlog, so grab some tea or something to do while you listen. And yeah, mental health is just something that I find really, really important. It's absolutely central to my life, the work that I do in order to heal and to be the best version of myself that I can be. And to me, that's also inextricably linked to my art. And so that's also why I share about this stuff, because my art and who I am is very connected. So that's it. I'll see you on the flip side. Healing is hard work. It's worth it, but yeah, it's hard work. Hey everybody. I didn't plan on filming today. It's not like I was, planning on making a vlog for a bit and suddenly, like that I planned it out or whatever. So I hope you'll forgive me if it's a little bit unorganized. I just felt like coming on here and filming a vlog. Maybe because it's been almost a year since that, almost, not completely, but it's been almost a year since that first vlog where I kind of told you about my breakdown that I had in March. And I guess I want to explain a little bit, let you know what's happening, maybe give you some insight into some of the things that have been helping me heal. I just wanted to share, I guess. It's funny, when I made that vlog last year, I kind of like thought, okay, the worst of my breakdown is past. Now it can only get better. And making those vlogs for you, the two that I made that talked about that, is kind of like how, I don't know, it just felt like markers, I guess. And I think with this vlog I kind of want to establish this vlog as a marker as well, internally, while also completely breaking the notion of markers at all. I guess one of the things that I'm learning is that healing is not a linear thing. Obviously, we all know that, but easier said than actually integrated. And this past year has been really challenging for a number of reasons. And I still think that things are getting better, even though, I don't want to make markers of progress or whatever, but they are. I feel like I'm finding better ways of dealing with everything. My fridge just turned on. I'm going to go turn it off. I apologize for the slow start. I know sometimes when I'm trying to figure out what it is that I want to say, it comes out pretty slow and kind of cut up. I hope you'll bear with me. That's, I guess, what happens when you don't plan a vlog and you just end up picking up your camera and filming, like what I just did today. It's funny because I think I know why I'm struggling to figure out how to say this or whatever, because in my vlogs, in even my own personal work, I kind of always hope that things that I will say or share will help others in their own journey, in your own journey. And at the same time, I don't feel like I'm an expert at this at all. So it's kind of like I'm just trying to figure this out just as much as all of you. So maybe that's why I'm struggling with saying it clearly, because I want to give you something when actually there isn't anything really to give, and rather I think I just want to share. Because one of the things that I'm realizing helps me a lot is when other people share what they're going through, even if it's not, even if I don't necessarily, I'm not going to take everything that they say ad verbatim or whatever. So yeah, and I guess it's just hard, it's still hard to simply come from a place of me sharing myself and not having it be like something that I'm like trying to teach or impart or give to others, which in itself is, I think, not really necessarily healthy. I think that it's scary to simply just share what goes on inside without there being anything else other than that. So I think maybe that's what this vlog is about. I just want to share what I've been going through. One of the big things so obviously I talk about this pretty frequently on my Instagram and to you guys, that I have had a lot of trauma during my upbringing, during my childhood, my teenage years. I came from my family. My parents were very abusive, emotionally, psychologically. They were also very neglectful. It's interesting because I do have like one very strong memory of physical abuse, but I wouldn't say that is, and I know that there were more. But the interesting thing is I don't want to actually, when I talk about it, I want to talk more about the emotional and the psychological abuse, because from what I've learned, at least in the research, that's actually one of the most detrimental things that children and teenagers can go through, is emotional and psychological abuse. Not to say that it's like a competition. It's not a competition. But I find that emotional and psychological abuse still in a lot of people's minds, including in myself for a long time, though now I'm pretty clear on that now. But I think in a lot of people's minds, physical or sexual abuse, of course, which is also horrendous, is kind of more violent. And again, it's not a competition. I guess the reason I'm saying that is just because the invisible wounds that emotional and psychological abuse creates are very, very deep-rooted, and they're invisible. And so it makes it a lot more difficult for people and victims of those kinds of abuse to even recognize it or validate it. So I think that's why I want to emphasize that, I guess. Interestingly, I recently was on a few forums for people who, like me, struggle with complex PTSD. And a lot of them actually, or a lot of the things that I read, including people who did have forms of sexual abuse or physical abuse, also said, and that surprised me, that they found the emotional and psychological toll of all that. Because obviously if you're dealing with psychological or sexual abuse, then you're also dealing with emotional and psychological abuse. Physical, did I say that right? If you're dealing with sexual or physical abuse, then obviously there's also a lot of emotional and psychological abuse that's going along with that. And it just surprised me to see that a lot of the people who were talking about that said that the emotional part was almost harder than the visible wounds, I guess. Visible, yeah. All right, future me here again. I'm just butting in here because I realized I started talking about complex PTSD as though you knew what it was, which you might not. And just wanted to give like a few little insights on what it is. So a lot of you might have probably heard about the word PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder. That's something that can arise if you've experienced a traumatic event and it overwhelms your nervous system. It's not able to process it, and it comes out as PTSD. Complex PTSD is similar in that it's also an overwhelm of your nervous system, a lot of symptoms that are associated with it. One of the distinctions is that PTSD is usually a single event. Complex PTSD is if it was chronic, like multiple events. And so, for example, you know, if they say that it can also be like more severe if it was by a parent or a carer, so somebody who's with you like almost all the time as you're growing up. That obviously makes it worse. Not everybody who experiences abuse or neglect growing up will develop complex PTSD. But some do. I'm one of those people who did. For better or for worse. But there are a lot of different symptoms. A lot of them are, and I'm just going to maybe just read a few of them for you. So I'm refilming this little part because I realized it was kind of disorganized the way that I was explaining it. But so basically, complex PTSD, according to the World Health Organization, has similar symptoms to general PTSD. And so there's kind of 3 criteria for that. One of them is intrusion symptoms, which is flashbacks. For complex PTSD, more often emotional flashbacks. And I get a little bit more into that in like the rest of the video. But also nightmares, that's another intrusive symptom. Repeated thoughts about the trauma, so like intrusive kind of thoughts, reliving it, replaying it. Then you have avoidance symptoms, and that's dissociation, emotional numbing, avoiding potential triggers. When I was at my worst, for example, I was avoiding a lot of things because a lot of things were triggering me. So I wasn't seeing as many friends, etc., etc., etc. Third cluster is reactivity symptoms. So this is hyperarousal. Insomnia is also one of them, hypervigilance. I'm going to talk about hyperarousal just after this, just because I think it's an interesting thing to note. And then, but for complex PTSD, you have there's three additional clusters of symptoms. One of them is difficulty regulating your emotions. So mood swings, emotional regulation not happening very well. More of like developing like a negative self-concept or self-identity. A lot of shame, a lot of guilt. And disturbances in relationships. So more specifically, like struggling with trusting people, even people that you're close to, isolating yourself, whether purposefully or not, because of these issues. Yeah, that kind of thing. So, I think I've gotten a clearer picture. I've given you a clearer picture of what it is. And I'm just going to come back to this little description linked to hyper and hypoarousal, because I thought that was, it helped me a lot when things were not doing well, when I was really not doing well. Understanding the window of tolerance and how you navigate that, or what was actually happening, really helped. So yeah, see you in a bit. I don't know how much detail I should go into this, but basically we all have a window of tolerance where we function pretty well. So it means like whether it's the highs or the lows, you're within a window where your functioning is pretty regular, like you're able to deal with stuff in a sense that's moderately healthy, I would say. When you've experienced a lot of trauma and you've developed complex PTSD, that window of tolerance is thinner. So that means that you can more quickly go outside of your window of tolerance. Going outside of your window of tolerance, not great. That's when you have a lot of symptoms. And there are kind of two levels. So you have it where it's too high or it's too low. So what I mean by that is that if you're too low, that's called hypoarousal, then you're dissociating, you're numbing, you're not really connected, you're kind of like maybe waves of exhaustion, maybe similar things to like depression, apathy, kind of that kind of stuff. And then the flip side of that is hyperarousal, where you're more on edge, you're more irritable, you maybe have more mood swings, little things will like kind of set you off, you're kind of high energy. That can also be positive things, but there's like an edginess to it. I don't know how else to explain it. So yeah, and when you experience complex PTSD, then what happens is like you're kind of out of sync with your window of tolerance, and you're kind of jumping maybe more quickly between the hyperarousal and the hypoarousal. And it's more difficult for you to stay within that window of tolerance. And through therapy and like inner work, you can start to thicken that window of tolerance so you're no longer in hyperarousal or hypoarousal. But of course, the first step of that is noticing when you're in those things. And all I can say is that for me personally, I wasn't able to necessarily immediately recognize when I was in those two edges until it became really extreme, which is what happened after my breakdown in March of 2019, where I was really in hypoarousal, very dissociated, couldn't concentrate, couldn't focus. Yeah. So it was kind of like that. So, I don't know, have I said all the things? Yeah, I think I've mentioned pretty much everything. Anyway, I just wanted to pop on just to give a little bit more of a description of that. Of course, I'm not an expert. I'm not a therapist. You know, self-diagnosing can be useful, but always refer to experts. They know what they're doing. I don't know. I think that's maybe just my message. And wanted to give you a little bit of an explanation of what it is that I'm actually talking about in the rest of this video. When I looked at the symptoms of complex PTSD, I mean, I knew that I had PTSD, but I didn't realize how much that label of complex PTSD really encapsulates a lot of the symptoms that I deal with. I've had a lot of periods in my life where I feel like the symptoms abated, or they weren't as strong, or I was doing well. And it's interesting because I still think that within those experiences, or my memory of those experiences, I still had a lot of dysfunctional survival mechanisms going on, being used at the forefront, that were kind of masking some of the other stuff. And I really feel like this past year has been an uncovering of all the layers. And I don't think that we ever can really see all the layers that build us, that are a part of us. But gaining awareness of those layers, for me, is really helping me heal. And I say heal as though that's like, there's like a finish line. I don't think that there is a finish line. And that gets me a little emotional at times, because sometimes that's a hard, sometimes that awakens feelings of hopelessness, which is a symptom of complex PTSD. And then another part of me knows that it's actually okay, and that even though there's no finish line, I can build a beautiful, rich life and recover from these symptoms and work on them to create a more, to find myself again. Because that's what abuse does, is it fragments you. That's how I feel, at least personally. I experience it as a fragmentation. And this past year I've been really working on simply trying to see those fragments. Because, like I said, there were a lot of times where I was fine, but that was also a survival mechanism that separated me from those parts that were hurting, let's say. And right now I'm trying to bring those together. To bring the parts that hurt and invite them to be part of the parts of me that don't hurt, so that they don't exist in these separate spaces anymore, but so that they can listen to each other and help each other, if that makes sense. I'm really a fan of taking problems and attacking them from as many angles as possible. And actually that goes for a lot of things, whether it's like, trying to make a living, or, creativity, or anything really. I think that having a multifaceted approach to life and to its challenges is really useful, as long as it doesn't fall into overwhelm. But for me personally, I've found that keeps you keeps me open-minded to, okay, if I feel stuck, it maybe means that I just need to find a new way of approaching that stuckness. Some of the things that have helped me a lot recently, my therapist, during one of my sessions, kind of asked me, how old do you feel when this and this happens? Or I don't quite remember. Maybe she was asking me, how old do you feel at that moment? I don't quite remember. But I do remember that when she asked me that, I was like, oh, I don't know. And I kind of thought it was besides the point, or not relevant. But somehow that stuck with me. And I've been using that as a tool to identify when I'm actually experiencing an emotional flashback. And an emotional flashback is one of the symptoms of complex PTSD, which I only recently read about. And when I read about that, it just hit me like a light bulb, oh my God, this is exactly what I experience a lot of the time. Because when you think about PTSD, you think of flashbacks, you're thinking of, let's say war veterans who are back in a war-torn zone, and it feels like they're living that moment of pure terror. And what I experience is not necessarily linked to images, or it's not like I hear things or see things as though I was back in that moment. However, I do feel things as though I was back in an abusive moment. And so realizing that a flashback can be emotional rather than, let's say, a visual flashback or an auditory flashback, that really, I don't know, it blew my mind. So anyway, I started trying to pay attention to when is it that I'm experiencing these flashbacks. And in that moment, to ask myself, how old do I feel? And it's funny because I get very, very clear notions of how old I am. So that to me is already a very clear indicator that I'm working with trauma memories. And sometimes it's not even necessarily a single age. Sometimes it can be an age that's shifting. And that also blew my mind. That at a moment where I'm experiencing an emotional flashback, I can have a very clear idea. I'm like, oh wow, I'm shifting between a bunch of different ages at this moment. And somehow asking myself that question allows me to douse those parts in love and compassion, and try to give those parts what they never got at the moment that they were actually experiencing it. There's something called parts theory, and I haven't done a bunch of research on this, but I've done some And for people, for example, who deal with dissociative identity disorder, it's kind of taken to an extreme where basically our personality is made up of all these different parts. And when we interact with the world, we're constantly switching between these parts. You know, whether you're with family or with friends or in a work environment. And that's obviously very simplistic, but you know, there's many different parts of our personality that come to the forefront at different moments. And in dissociative identity disorder, these parts become so fragmented and separated that they actually become as though it feels like there are different people within you. And the person, from what I know, the person doesn't even necessarily like speak the same way, dress the same way, move the same way, etc. Obviously, that's a really extreme form of that. But coming back to that notion of we are multifaceted, multiformed human beings also has been really helping me, because it allows the and to exist. So, for example, departures are often very triggering for me. When my partner leaves, for whatever, like let's say it could be to go visit his family or to go on a trip, those moments trigger very intense flashbacks. And one of the things that I worked on with my therapist a month or two ago is I didn't feel like, obviously I love my partner and I want him to be happy. I want him to do the things that fill him with joy. So because of that, I would try to be supportive when he had to or wanted to go somewhere, and at the same time I was being triggered. And so I would start creating distance between him and me. And one of the things that I was working on with my therapist is she made me realize I'm allowed to say that I need him to stay. And I wasn't even allowing myself to think that, because if I did, to me it meant that I was being selfish and that I didn't want his happiness. Coming back to the parts theory, realizing that I'm allowed to have different parts that have different wants, it helped me resolve that tension. So there's a part of me that can deeply want and need him to stay. And there's another part that can deeply want and need to support him and love him and allow him to do what he needs to do. Before working on this with my therapist, she actually had invited me to simply vocalize and say, I need you to stay. I had so much internal tension that I was unable to say that. And I was like, no, I'm not going to say that. That's selfish. And working on accepting that there are parts of me that want and need things that are not the things that the adult part of me wants or needs, that's a huge relief. It's such an inclusive way of working with the different parts of ourselves. And instead of it being a battle between parts that are like one that's trying to say something and then the other one that says, shut up, you're not allowed to say anything, that's wrong. It's like that's really traumatizing in itself if you're doing that to yourself. So instead, to allow those parts of us that are in pain or in experiencing sadness, experiencing anger, experiencing deep loneliness, allowing those to come to the table and really speak their truth. That's incredibly powerful. And I get emotional because I don't think I'd ever really allowed myself to do that, because I was so afraid of hurting others or being selfish or being a bad person. And yet, those parts of ourselves that are sad or angry or enraged or lonely or melancholic, all these negative emotions, or rather all these emotions that we associate with negativity, they have really beautiful messages to give us. And they're also there to protect us. They sometimes get it wrong. They do it in ways that are unhealthy for us or that hurt others. But if we listen to the actual messages that they have, that they carry, if we invite them to the table, then we can find more loving ways of giving those parts what they need. Another one of the things that I struggle with, or that I have struggled with, is suicidal thoughts. And that's something that I attempted suicide when I was 16. And following that, suicidal thoughts would only come at very extreme moments of distress. If I had a really bad argument and I couldn't cope, and didn't know how. But what's changed recently is that they started coming at other moments that seemingly weren't distressing. I wasn't in the middle of an argument. I wasn't, experiencing like an active crisis. And that's been really difficult to deal with. But one of the things that I realized is that I'm being given the opportunity to reparent myself. When I attempted suicide when I was 16, the following day I didn't go to school. My mom told me I didn't have to go to school. But it was never talked about again. It's like literally it didn't even exist. Years later, there was even discussion about whether it even happened. Which is a whole other story. But one of the forms of abuse that I had to deal with was my reality being constantly questioned, to the point where at some points I had no idea what was true or not true. For this, I know it's true, and I never had any doubt about that. So yeah, when that came out that there were certain members of my family who even questioned whether it actually happened or whether it was serious, that really, yeah, that was ridiculous. Anyway, my point is simply that part of me was never acknowledged or given space or given love or compassion or reassurance or even heard for the pain that part of me experiences. And me having more suicidal thoughts is an opportunity to really invite that part to the table and to give her the space that she needs. And that it's okay if she wants to die, even if the adult part of me is going to keep us all alive, if that makes sense. So anyway, my point is not, people often get scared that when you talk about suicidal thoughts that's that it's bad, that it'll make it worse, but actually it's the opposite. So talking about suicidal thoughts is actually more healing, and there where it gets tricky is if you're not talking about them. And I debated whether I should talk to you all about this, simply because, I mean, it is something that's quite deep, quite difficult maybe. I know that not everybody experiences suicidal thoughts, and I am actively, working on healing. So I guess my point is I don't want anybody to worry, because I'm surrounded by supportive people, loving people, and including therapy and all the other things that I do to actively heal myself. But I do think that it's important to talk about that, because those parts are also a part of human experience. Not everybody's human experience, but mine at least. And as an artist, as a person, I think that it's really important to embrace all parts of the human experience, even the more difficult ones. So, yeah, I guess I just wanted to share that with you. There's a lot of stuff that's changing for the better, which doesn't make it any less hard on some days, but shining a light into all the complexities of my corners helps me. And the contradictions that we have, the contradictions that I have, can coexist. And they're all worthy of love. I'm sending you love, if you need it.